Thanks very much for coming, everyone. We're going to start off the program with music.
Das Tristan meint, Sonnenlicht nicht scheint, es ist das Dunkel nicht gelernt, daraus die Guten mich entsandt, dass ihm im Tode sie empfangen, im Tod sie ließen das Licht gelangen. Was da sie mich gewahr, ein fahles Lau, sein rotes Riesen rötete dich. Kalt lagst du da, das warme legtest du kühl. Ho, 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 ha, ja, ha. Nun hat die Gutlich rot geglüht, eine weiche Härte den Hammer weicht. Soll ich willst du mir funkeln, dass ich nicht Böden gezwingt? Ho, 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 ho. Ahai, ahai, ahai.
We just heard Stuart Skelton singing Wohin nun Tristan scheidet from the second act of Tristan, followed by Ben Heppner doing the Schmiede Lied from the first act of Siegfried. Both excerpts, both selections were conducted by Simon Rattle with the Berlin Philharmonic. What is a Heldentenor? The two chief roles featuring Heldentenor writing at its most heroic are the Wagner Tristan and the Wagner Siegfried, both Siegfried and Götterdämmerung. Much historic stylistic gestation is behind this vocal development. Tristan and Siegfried don't emerge from a vacuum. But because these two roles show Heldentenor writing at its most intense, the singers spotlighted tonight have either Tristan or Siegfried or both under their belt. Such a tenor has an atypically sonorous middle register to encompass a relatively baritonal tessitura at critical points throughout, great endurance and stamina to maintain the extended heroic declamation throughout, and the capacity to cut through heavy orchestration. I'd also maintain a rich dramatic development and characterization that Wagner's genius brings to the music requires an affecting humanity in the performer. So I chose Skelton and Heppner to open tonight's program, not only for their vocal allure, but because of that elusive simpatico quality. The four other Wagner roles in this type, in this group, are Rienzi, Tannhäuser, Siegmund, and Parsifal. Rienzi and Parsifal can sometimes get by with less than full-fledged Heldentenors, perhaps Spinto tenors, perhaps Jugendlichs, both a step lower than or step lighter than Heldentenor, but Tannhäuser and Siegmund do suffer much more if undercast. Fortunately, it's harder for impresarios to ignore the distinct Helden characteristics of Siegmund, since it's Wagner's most heavily baritonal tenor role, with the lowest tessitura of all, and Tannhäuser's challenges include both heavily baritonal writing in the last act and intense vocal writing higher up in the earlier acts, with especially heavy orchestration in the second. Most vocal characteristics in Tristan and Siegfried are found in the other four, but the earliest of those, Rienzi and Tannhäuser, reveal in addition more of the original DNA undergirding the Tannhäuser, the Heldentenor type, to wit, the certain ingredients that Wagner learned as a penniless reviewer in Paris, 1839 to 1841, when the earlier heroic type, introduced in Paris with Arnauld and Rossini's Guillaume Tell and the title role in Meyerbeer's Rebelle et Diable, was all the rage. So this type was still rooted in bel canto, but Adolphe Nerit, who created these roles, also brought superb acting and a rich middle register, not a given for tenors, Nazzari being the only other contemporary megastar with a similar low. Nerit was trained by the most demanding and respected teacher of them all, Manuel Garcia Sr. With his passionate engagement in his Garcia training and in the plays that he attended regularly, Nerit is among the most widely accomplished and well-versed performers in opera. But before Wagner arrived, Gilbert Louis Dupré had taken over these roles and also created the Berlioz Cellini and Polyute in Donizetti's Martyr. He brought not only a heroic sound, but a voix sombre and the first known high C from the chest, rather than the well-developed head tone of singers like Nerit. The voix sombre meant a darker, more wide vocal quality at the top than any tenor had produced before. Such were the sounds Wagner had in his head when he started composing Rienzi in Paris. So Wagner didn't come from a vacuum. He was totally steeped in the operas of his day, and in fact, along with the turbulent school of hard knocks in Paris, he had also conducted some 200 operas at various houses. Ultimate celebrity in Dresden was merely the culmination of a long and painful journey. Both in Rienzi and Tannhäuser we have not only recognizable ingredients of the Wagner Heldentenor, including heroic declamation, the occasional baritonal tessitura, but a degree of vocal suppleness and flexibility reminiscent of Meyerbeer's Rebelle et Diable and Donizetti's Martyr. While that earlier French type lacks the profound musical dramatic development Wagner does bring, its juxtaposition of remarkably agile vocal daring-do on top and heroic phrasing lower down can be even harder to cast than the Heldentenor, which doesn't put a premium on pyrotechnics higher up. Tackling this French type with success demonstrates a fabulous degree of vocal control across one's range, and both Josef Ticzacek, the first Rienzi and Tannhäuser, and Ludwig Schnorr von Karlsfeld, the first Tristan, were adept at this French repertoire, sung in German. The grounding these Paris roles provide, if thoroughly mastered, is of inestimable benefit in acquiring the sheer stamina and resourcefulness needed to survive the Wagner heroes. Both Ticzacek and Schnorr brought this background to their Wagner singing. Although Ben Heppner and our next artist John Vickers didn't tackle these roles, or at least the hardest of them, they did distinguish themselves in Berlioz's Troyen, the role of Aeneas, and both of them tackled other roles that called extensively on a degree of bel canto agility not that much associated with Heldentenors of the past 80 years, roles like Idomeneo, sung by Heppner, and the Handel Samson, sung by Vickers. We are going to hear an example of Vickers in one of his greatest roles, the closing, moving moments of Parsifal under the baton of Hans Knappertsbusch. This is John Vickers in 1964 at Bayreuth singing Nur eine Waffe taugt. We just heard John Vickers in the closing moments of Parsifal, or the closing moments for his role, Nur eine Waffe taugt, recorded in 1964 at Bayreuth with Hans Knappertsbusch at the podium. Well, this opening portion of tonight's program has been to show the genuinely beautiful Heldentenor singing of the high fidelity era. At this point, going back between the reigns of Mr. Vickers and Lauritz Melchior in the 30s and 40s, a number of Heldentenors intervene who don't have the same preeminence as a Vickers or a Melchior, but can be compelling. We hear four: Ludwig Zuchthaus, Ramon Vinay, Seth Svanholm, and Wolfgang Wingassen. Although Svanholm and Vinay start as baritones, both the Zuchthaus and Vinay sounds are deeper and more quintessentially Helden in timbre than either Svanholm's or Wingassen's, the latter having always been a tenor. Vinay may have a richer, darker sound than Svanholm, but Svanholm has the more resilient technique. To understand why, we're going to bring in an interesting figure, a baritone, John Forzel. John Forzel was a singer and teacher of the early 20th century. He had been taught by the tenor Julius Gunther and by the soprano Signe Hebe. Signe Hebe studied with Francesco Lamperti, and Julius Gunther studied with Manuel Garcia. Well, if there was any singing school that was almost as prestigious as Manuel Garcia, it was the Francesco Lamperti School. And Forzel, in his teaching, fused both Garcia and Lamperti's teaching. And in fusing that, was the successful teacher of not only Seth Svanholm, but two other illustrious tenors as well, none other than Axel Scherz and Jussi Björling. This was an amazing man and an amazing teacher. During part of the 40s, Svanholm and Zuchthaus, and in the latter part of the 40s, Ramon Vinay were all active. But we're going to start these four selections with Ludwig Zuchthaus, who was Wilhelm Furtwängler's most trusted go-to Heldentenor. And we hear an example of their collaboration in Tristan, live at the Berlin State Opera in 1947. Vinay had a panoply of vocal colors, including some truly fine piano singing, which we can savor at length in this second selection from Tristan, conducted by Herbert von Karajan, 1952. For Svanholm, with his Garcia and Lamperti training, I have elected to offer the one non-Wagnerian selection of the evening, a live Amneris Radames scene from the last act of Aida, Giai Sacerdoti, opposite Blanche Thebom's Amneris under the baton of Cesare Sodero. Svanholm's Wagner recordings may be fairly familiar to some here, but this Verdi duet was certainly intriguing for me the first time I heard it. Wolfgang Wingassen is one of the few artists heard tonight who was arguably more Jugendlich than a real Heldentenor, but he was an extremely adroit Jugendlich, so well prepared musically that he was able to retain a musicality in his singing long after his instrument had become dry and reedy through singing outside his real Fach. We catch him here in 1956 with most of the juice still intact, from Götterdämmerung Helle Wehr with Astrid von Eisbrunhilde, conducted by Hans Knappertsbusch. Note the fluency in Wingassen's singing, like the well-lubricated coloratura turn at Mutter with its tricky high C.
wehend drang sie bang, als einst dem Kind des Vaters Tod verkündet. Durch morgengrauen Bang und Hänger, als der Sohn der Mutter aus vernahm. Da mich zeugt und starb, sie sterben mich gebar. Die alte Weise Sehnsucht bange zu jener wohl auch klagend gedank. Ja, es mich frug und jetzt mich fragt, zu welchem Los erkoren ich damals wohl geboren, zu welchem Los. Die alte Weise sagte mir's wieder, mich sehnen und sterben. lässt ihn nicht hinauf zur Warte, du Blöder, nicht, was so hell und licht ist will, das macht ihn nicht entgehen. Öffnes Licht, du Warte, schnell, ein Arme, in so schnell, das Kind, ich soll das Kind, du musst es sehen, öffnes Licht, das Kind, selbst du kannst nicht. tut sich lege, die eines Unholds argen ließ, wider uns allen erregt. Ihr Mannen, kehrt euch ab, lasst das Weib gekeift. Ein Sage, weich mir gern, die lässt mit Zungen den Streit. Glaub mir, zürnt es mich als dich, das schlägt dich sie getäuscht. Der Kampfheld dünkt mich fast, Partei, du mich gehst, doch Frauentreu friedet sich bald, dass ich dir es gewann. Dank dir gewiesen noch das Weib. Mutter, ihr Mantel, zeig mir zum Weib. Trotz Zeit hättet ihr Frauen völlige Lust nach Maus.
We just heard Ludwig Zuchthaus singing Muss ich dich so verstehen from 1947 under Wilhelm Furtwängler, followed by Ramon Vinay showing us his piano in Und drauf Isolde, sung under Herbert von Karajan in 1952, followed by Sed Svanholm and Blanche Thebum performing Jai Sacerdoti from the last act of Aida in 1946, and winding up with Wolfgang Wingassen and Astrid Vornay singing Helle Wehr under Hans Knappertsbusch, 1956. And now the 1930s, which is the generation of both Melchior and Max Lorenz. Max Lorenz is problematic to a degree in my hearing because he does not really have the kind of vocal consistency that Lawrence Melchior did. So we're going to be starting with an example of Max Lorenz very young with his fine line, beautiful tuning, beautiful diction, doing Winterstürmer in 1930. We continue with Lauritz Melchior, the Heldentenor of them all, for many a listener, in 1940, his peak year, singing the Schmiedelied from the first act of Siegfried under Edwin MacArthur's direction.
Wichen im Wangenmond, in wildem Lichte leuchtet der Lenz, auf linden Lüften leicht und lieb. Leben, der sich wiegt, durch Wald und Bauern fließt sein Atem, weit geöffnet lacht sein Aug. Aus Silbervöglein Klange süß ertönt, holde Düfte haucht aus, seinem warmen Blut entblühen wonnige Blumen, Keim und Spross entspringt seiner Kraft. In zarter Waffen hier bezwingert die Welt, Wind vorwischen der starke Wehr, und musste den tapferen Streich strenge Tür aufweichen die trotzige Stadt und trennte von
und schwebte die Woche, schaffte den Fall und machte die
We just heard from the 1930s and from 1940, Max Lorenz singing Wintersturme, 1930, and Lawrence Melchior singing the Schmiedelied from Act II of Siegfried, 1940, Edwin MacArthur conducting. There is one leading Heldentenor of the generation before Lorenz and Melchior who lasted just as long as Melchior, Heinrich Knote. Born in 1870, he made his farewell to opera as late as 1932, singing the role of Siegfried 40 years after his operatic debut in 1892. He was 62. Here we hear him performing Siegfried's final moments in Götterdämmerung, recorded in 1930 at the age of 60, Frieder Weissmann at the podium. We just heard Heinrich Knote, at the age of 60, is singing Siegfried's final moments in Götterdämmerung with Frieder Weissmann at the podium. René Verdier was the last tenor who made a habit of singing the most taxing heroic roles of the Paris Grand Opera along with daunting Wagnerian roles. This had been a tradition for some time before. Indeed, Verdier is not even the most accomplished in that tradition. But being the last to keep it alive, he has a legitimate place in this story. He is an important gateway to some of the most staggering talents in tenor history, artists who seem to have recognized virtually no limits to the dramatic tenor voice. He even mastered a Rameau part in his 50s. So, we launch this section on the most versatile dramatic tenors preserved on disc with Verdier's Siegmund Heissig, sung in French opposite the Sieglinde of Germaine Lubin under the baton of Henri de Fosse, recorded in 1930.
Fixer notre sort, unis nos cœurs pleins de tendresse, ton amour, ton amour, nos tongues, ainsi je t'appelle, nos tongues, glaive en tige et toi, l'éclair de ta lame étincelle, hors du courant, viens à moi. Sois libre et sois heureuse, ta chaîne et t'engage mon cœur. Quitte au couteau et tu âme joyeuse, c'est toi maudit ou plein de malheur. Viens pardon, viens suis-moi, viens à toi et bravo, tout s'appelle le mon glaive de tes pas, et l'amour nous sourit d'un regard triomphant. La sang des aïeux.
We just heard René Verdier and Germaine Lubin singing Siegmund Heissig with Henri de Fosse at the podium. Now we turn to Tannhäuser, a crossroads between Meyerbeer and mature Wagner. It is as heavy as Tristan und Siegfried in places, but not throughout. Still, it's arguably trickier to master, because its singing falls between two stools. In the first act, the writing is relatively high and flexible, heavy, but not that heavy. While the last act is so dramatic, it is actually more baritonal than anything in Siegfried or Tristan, while being just as heavy. It appears from one or two unconfirmed references that this may have been one reason, this baritonal writing in the last act, why the pioneer for his generation, Jean de Reszke in the 1890s, who brought the fusing of the French Grand Opera and the heroic Wagner to the international stage, chose to avoid Tannhäuser entirely. We do know for certain he avoided Siegmund because of its deepest baritonal tessitura of all. He had started out as a baritone, but once a tenor, he was careful to keep his voice up with the roles that he chose. For him, he maintained three of the more high-lying and agile dramatic roles in the Paris rep throughout: Robert, Raoul in Huguenot, and Jean in Le Prophète. In doing that, he was just as careful with his Wagner repertoire, which is why he stopped at Tristan and Siegfried and never moved on to Tannhäuser. Of course, of those Wagner roles outside Tristan and Siegfried, Tannhäuser is definitely the most demanding, and you'll find many specialists who will claim it has much more to do with the Tristan-Siegfried group, does Tannhäuser, than with the Rienzi-Siegmund Parsifal. At any rate, Tannhäuser certainly had the most international gestation. First premiered in German in 1845, and then premiered in a revision for Paris in 1861. In the international spirit of that gestation, we take this opportunity of presenting the three finest non-German Heldentenors on disc: Paul Franz, a Frenchman, Giuseppe Borgatti, an Italian, and Ivan Yershoff, a Russian. In fact, in sheer breadth of repertoire and length of career, Franz and Yershoff fully match Jacques Urlus, whom we'll hear presently, not to mention the original Rienzi and Tannhäuser, Josef Tischacek. Paul Franz has been praised by more than one Paris opera goer as the finest Heldentenor of them all, and the first half of his Tannhäuser Rome narrative certainly reveals a stunning artist. Secondly, we will hear Giuseppe Borgatti singing the second half of the Rome narrative in Italian. Unlike Franz, Borgatti does not appear to have mastered the same tricky roles in the French repertoire sung by his colleague Paul Franz. But Borgatti, unlike either Franz or Yershoff, did perform Wagner in the original German and at Bayreuth. We do not have any record of him singing Wagner in the original, but the second half of this Tannhäuser narrative is certainly a remarkable document. He was the leading Heldentenor in Italy at the time, and he also created the role of Andrea Chenier when still quite young. His stage career ended prematurely and tragically in sudden blindness, but we can be grateful he made a sequence of unforgettable recordings in 1919, when he could only appear in concert. So we hear two halves of the narration, one from Franz and the other from Borgatti. We wind up this international portion, this international section of the program, with Ivan Yershoff, again one of the finest tenors on disc, who sang only in Russian and sang everything, from Handel's Samson to contemporary premieres like from the pen of composers like Tanaev, etc. And in the midst of that was the leading heroic Heldentenor in Wagner in Russia. We switch from Tannhäuser to Siegfried with his Schmiedelied, recorded with piano accompaniment in 1903.
grâce abattait la fierté du péché dans mon cœur. les yeux, son cœur docile, j'offrais au ciel mon sang, n'osant prier. Quand sur la route il trouvait un asile, je me couchais au sein du froid glacier. Les yeux fermés à sa plaine fleurie, je parcourus aveugle l'Italie. Ainsi j'offrais ma souffrance en échange pour adoucir les larmes de mon âme. Al sacro Tito e all'alta soglia mi prostrai pentito. Il dispuntò suonar le sfilettante allor che ud intonar celeste suono. Ad une gridar del popolo esultante la grazia prometteva del perdono. La vidia puoi e a Dio ministro elesse, a lui davanti il popolo si prostrò. A mille afflitti il suo perdor concesse, a mille peccator e il cuore celò. E lei che si pregò e gridò: giusta suoi tu, nefando amor, che soll'averno a prestar fuor al Monte Vener fossi ancor, annoso sei per celebre mar, come il bordone che tieni in man, mai fresca foglia germoglierà, così dal fuoco di Satan, ma l'alma tua ti salverà. Genius. Ha, 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 hey, ha, hey. Et da abbiam ja rasta fil im volas moi cavalche da leggende che pensi fava I fava timpus ha 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 ha.
Well, we just heard Franz, Paul Franz, a Frenchman, in the first half of Tannhäuser, recorded circa 1920, and Giuseppe Borgatti in the second half of the narration, sung in Italian, recorded in 1919, and we wound up with Ivan Yershov's Schmiede-Lied from Siegfried, recorded with piano in 1903. We now move on to tenors Hermann Winkelmann and Leo Slezak, both of them performers with Gustav Mahler, who had the Midas touch as an inspiring conductor, a child pianist, and, of course, one of the great composers. His leadership at the Vienna Court Opera was legendary, and both Hermann Winkelmann and Leo Slezak learned the role of Tannhäuser, it appears, under Gustav Mahler. Now, Winkelmann had already earned his spurs as a Wagnerian before working with Mahler, because he had been Wagner's choice to create the role of Parsifal at Bayreuth in 1882. As a performer admired by two towering geniuses, both Mahler and Wagner, we can guess at the stature of his artistry when in his prime. We do not hear him in his prime here. The voice is somewhat dried up. But what is interesting is that, like Tichacek and Schnorr before him, and like the pioneering Jean de Reszke, Winkelmann had fused the peaks of the French Grand Opera with his Wagnerian expertise. It is likely that Mahler had a hand in what we hear from both Winkelmann's Hymn to Venus, played first, and Leo Slezak's Hymn to Venus, played second. Winkelmann's comes from 1905, and Slezak's from 1906. What we hear in Winkelmann is a surprisingly, relatively tender attack on certain high notes like Freiheit and Göttin. They give a considerate quality, a thoughtful quality to what Winkelmann is singing. The same thing happens with Leo Slezak in the line halfway through the Hymn to Venus, Doch sterblich ach bin ich verblieben, where there is a gentle, considerate quality. Is this family resemblance due to Mahler? Perhaps. As a listening experience, Winkelmann is clearly compromised because we hear him at the very end of his career with a dried-up sound. Slezak is more of a puzzle. We hear him here, still in his prime, in 1906. But some collectors differ on what they are hearing in his recordings. Some insist that there is an unsteadiness under pressure, and others say no, that is just the recording apparatus exaggerating a very strong vibrato. Whichever it is, there is no question that Slezak has, like Winkelmann, a live, poetic imagination in this repertoire.
Alle Szenen und jede Folge und Hand von dir. Die Glut, die du mir in das Herz gegossen, als Blumenludren, hierlei, dagegen alle Welt, die uns verdrossen, verstand ich tut ein wieder weiter sein, doch ich muss ich durch besser Erden, bei dir kann ich nur Glaube werden, deinem Reich ich bin. O Königin, Göttin, lass mich hin. Ihr schöne Luft, die Wunder sein gepriesen, wie eine Macht, ihr glücklicher Morschon. Die Wohnen süß, die deiner Huld entsprießen, erheb mein Lied in lautem Jubelruf. Nach Freude auf herrlichem Genießen verlangt mein Herz, es fürchtete mein Sinn. Aber zur Götter Seiten zur Wiesen, auf keine Gunst, wir Sterblichem dahin. Doch sterblicher bin ich geblieben, und lieber groß ist mir dein Lieben, entsteht ein Gott, der diesen kann, ich dem Wechsel untertan, nicht Lust allein liegt mir am Herzen, aus Freuden sehn ich mich nach Schmerzen. Aus deinem Reiche lass mich ziehen, o Königin, Göttin, lass mich fliehen.
We heard two hymns to Venus, one from Hermann Winkelmann in 1905 and the other from Leo Slezak in 1906, both alumni, if you will, of the fabulous Vienna ensemble led by Gustav Mahler. For Rienzi, the music comes off best when performed by artists steeped in the bel canto traditions Meyerbeer appropriated. In Jacques Oulus, we have a versatile musician with one of the most beautiful voices on disc. We hear him in Rienzi's less familiar aria, Esteja Hohe Roma, recorded in 1911. Jacques Oulus was arguably the most versatile of all. Not only did he perform Mozart along with 19th century repertoire and the French heroic repertoire, but in addition, he was a concert artist as well, doing works like St. Matthew Passion and the Das Lied von der Erde. And also, unlike Yershoff and unlike Franz, he matched their repertoire and he matched their longevity while also singing French roles in French towards the end of his career and Wagner roles in the original German during the apex of his career. Quite an artist. Next, we hear the familiar Allmächtige Vater from Act 5, this one sung in Italian. This will be our last non-German item of the evening. This is Francisco Viñas, the leading Wagner tenor at the Met before Jean de Reszke moved on to Tristan and Siegfried circa 1895 and following. Unlike de Reszke, Viñas assumed all the Wagner parts in Italian. He also lived the intimate connection between the Wagner template and the Meyerbeer template throughout his career. So now we will hear Esteja Hohe Roma from the first act of Rienzi and Allmächtige Vater from the last act of Rienzi. First we hear Jacques Oulus and then Francisco Viñas. We just heard Jacques Urlus and Francisco Viñas in excerpts from Rienzi, Estea Hoja Roma from Jacques Urlus, recorded 1911, and Almech Gavata, recorded 1912, Francisco Viñas's last recording session. Well, it is time to introduce the notorious Mapleson cylinders. Notorious because they are in very, very poor sound, and fair warning, this will be the murkiest sound in the program, so hold on. There was, though, such a cornucopia of Heldentenors at the Met at the time that these Mapleson cylinders were created that I feel we have to present at least two of them. Mr. Mapleson was a librarian at the Metropolitan Opera and took sneaky recordings from either the prompter's box or from the flies of performances as they occurred between 1901 and 1903. The results are highly variable. The preeminent tenor at this time was obviously Jean Dereshka. I've mentioned him already. He was the pioneering artist, the pioneering tenor of his generation. He started doing these roles in 1895, and his last year doing them was 1901. We can be grateful his singing was caught, but only in 1901 and only in these cylinders. Whatever heroic role he undertook, he always had a big success with it, and the variety of genres he tackled is simply staggering. To this day, very, very few tenors can equal him. Maybe Urlus, maybe Yershoff, maybe Franz, but that's about it. Dereshka was also an expert linguist, in addition to all else. What we do have of Dereshka singing in these Mapleson cylinders has crushingly bad sonics, so I only bring in one selection from Dereshka himself. We begin with Georgantes, a fine tenor in his own right, doing a portion of the duet from Tristan opposite Lilian Nordica, his Isolde, and a brief look-in from Ernestine Schumann-Heink as Brangena. Georgantes was another artist trained in the Garcia school. Precious few recordings of him exist. We can be grateful for this one. The second tenor is uncertain. Before moving to Dereshka, we move on to a mystery reading of the Schmiede Lied from Siegfried Act II. There is method in my madness. I've presented you with recording after recording tonight of the Schmiede Lied because I want you to be really, really familiar with this piece by the time we get to the second item in this section. The second item in this section is a Schmiede Lied whose identification is uncertain. Sometimes it has been ascribed to Jean Dereshka, sometimes it has been ascribed to Andreas Dippel, but nobody is really sure. It's a very fine reading. I like it very much, but I don't know who it could be. So that's item number 2 in this portion. The third item in this portion is going to be High Fidelity. It will be Sándor Kónya singing the brief lines Sie wurde dem König from the conclusion of the bridal chamber scene in the first scene of Act 3 of Lohengrin. Lohengrin is not a Heldentenor role, but this snippet of Lohengrin that we will hear Sándor Kónya singing is the only snippet that we have from Dereshka that is an even barely listenable sound from the Wagner repertoire. So in order to get you acclimated to the passage that we will be hearing from Mr. Dereshka himself, I'm giving you this hi-fi example of the same passage to have it clearly in your heads before we move on to the fourth item, which will be Jean Dereshka himself, a confirmed recording of Jean Dereshka doing these brief lines on the stage of the opera of the Metropolitan Opera House with Walter Damrosch conducting a performance from 1901. If you wish, and I've tried this myself, during the Kónya selection, you might want to try moving out of your seat and standing in the hallway and listening to the final Dereshka section, the Dereshka passage, which is about 45 seconds, in the hallway, because I've noticed that listening to something from outside a room can sometimes cut down on a lot of the scratch. It's a suggestion. And now we'll hear these 4 excerpts illustrating the 1901 to 1903 era at the Metropolitan Opera House.
Thank you.
We just heard from the Metropolitan Opera House in the early noughts, first Georg Antes and Lilia Nordica with Ernestine Schumann-Heincke's Bangena doing a portion of the Tristan and Isolde love duet, followed by a mystery tenor doing the Schmiede lied, possibly from 1902, followed by Sándor Kónya from 1959 doing the lines Sie wurde dem König from Lohengrin with Lvova Montačik conducting at Bayreuth in 1959, winding up with, finally, Jean Dereschke himself singing Sie wurde dem König on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House under Walter Damrosch in 1901. One does need to hear that last snippet several times to be aware of just what he's doing. There are some amazing dynamics that he's plying there, and a beautifully colored handling of some of the phrasing. It's unfortunate that the recording is so murky. I've learned to love it very much, but I have concluded that although repeated hearings can give me an idea of what Dereschke is doing, and it's very beautiful and very poetic, the more direct way to understand Dereschke may be by listening to one of his most beautiful pupils. He taught Johannes Sembach in the Wagner repertoire. Now, Johannes Sembach, like Wolfgang Wingassen, was very likely a Jugendlich rather than a real Heldentenor. But for a while, he did those Heldentenor roles with extreme beauty of tone. Nevertheless, once he was in his 40s, his control of intonation, of pitch, of staying in key started to decline. It was evident he had worn out the voice. This is why I think the conclusion is inevitable that he really was a Jugendlich. But when he was in his prime, what he did was so beautiful that it is worthwhile ending tonight's program with this selection. Here is a man who did start out as a baritone, but a baritone in light operetta. Then he became a Heldentenor and recorded this recording of not the Schmiede lied, but Notung, Notung, an acoustic recording showing the beauty of Dereschke's musical sensibility and of Dereschke's vocal training. I want to thank everybody for having come today. I want to thank the fellow collector, Harold Bruder, for having helped me on much of this documentation. I also want to thank my brother Charles, who helped with some of the transfers. And I want to thank, last and certainly not least, my wife, Elizabeth Hubble, who has brought me kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And finally, I want to thank Will Stewart, who has gone beyond yeoman service in helping prepare the tape that you view tonight. Thank you. Now let's have Mr. Sembach, and I look forward to your questions.
Was musstest du zerspringen? Gut Freund und schuf ich die scharfe Pracht, im Tiegel brach ich die Späne. Oh, 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 ja, oh, hei, oh, hei, oh, oh, hab ich im Tort gesehen, die braune Esche brannt sich zur Kohl auf dem Herd.